2013. How's the sound? Okay? In the back especially? Okay, good. I want to talk about this title. I want to talk about each of these words here in just a minute. But before I do that, I want to take a second to turn the tables and kind of find out a little bit about you all as a group. See if I can get that to work. There you go. So very quickly, I want to run through this and then we'll get back to those words on my title. How many of you are working in organizations or groups in organizations that primarily are focused on software development or IT/IS services? All right, quite a number. I was actually expecting many more, but that's a good number. So let me turn that around now. How many of you work for organizations or groups in your organizations that don't primarily focus on software development or IT and IS services? All right, good. I got one hand. Keep those hands up for just a second. I just wanted to show that we haven't even started the presentation, and we're starting to bust one of those myths that the Kanban method is strictly just for IT and IS operations. So good. My wife said, what are you going to do if nobody raises their hand? But I was ready. I had something like there. How about roles? How many project managers do we have here in the group? Okay, I was expecting a little more. How about like director and senior director levels? Okay. And how about VP and C levels in organizations about 200 or more? All right, I got a couple of C levels. That's always good to see. Let's go the other direction. How many of you are on the technical side as developers or QA? Interesting. I was expecting more. How about software architects? I always get a few software architects at a Kanban group meeting. So then, now, this is the Kanban Foundations track. How many of you are really, really brand new to Agile, the concept of Agile? Okay, so none. How about, one. Okay, great, that's all right. I want to just kind of know who I'm talking to. Okay, a few more. See, you did that and you broke the ice. All right. How about, who's new to the concept of lean? Okay, you can raise your hands up. You don't have to be embarrassed. This is why you're here, the Foundations track, right? And how many of you are really absolutely new to the concept of Kanban or pull systems? Dan Picanti is? Yes? Okay. All right, so a number of you. That's good. Well, great. That kind of gives me an idea as I go through the presentation. Maybe I'll tweak it here and there, okay? I do have to tell you, like Russell, I have some slack built into this presentation, so I have about 10 minutes worth of time for questions at the end. But if you want to throw one in at the, in the middle that's really pertinent, please feel free to do so. As I told you, I want to talk about this title and each of these words here for just a second. When I say Kanban, I'm not talking about the basic definition of a signboard or signal card, okay? And I'm not talking about one of the types of pull systems that are out there. I'm talking about the Kanban method, that method that's espoused in the book by David Kanban and also discussed quite a bit on the Kanban Dev Yahoo Tech group. Anybody follow that? Okay, that's another group that you can follow and get some more information. And also by many of us who run and support Limited Whip Society type related meetings, like for example the one I do in Denver, and I think we have one in Boston. That's the Kanban method I'm talking about, okay? So obviously the basic definition of a signboard and pull systems plays into it, but that's what we're really talking about is the Kanban method. And when I say myths, I'm talking about a word, and the key word here is an invented notion or story. So think about that. Keep that idea of invented in your mind as we go through this presentation. And when I say misconception, what I'm really talking about, the key word I want you to focus on is erroneous. So we're going to be talking about invented, erroneous notions about the Kanban method in this presentation. Now this is a track on Kanban Foundation, and you might be wondering why should we talk about myths and misconceptions? Why not talk more about the Kanban method itself? And I think these quotes help set the stage for a talk and why it's important to think about myths and misconceptions as we learn about something new. So I will be quiet for just a second as you read these quotes if you haven't already. Okay. So the reason I think it's important to understand that the myths and misconceptions are just part of naturally learning about something new. As we try to make sense of something, it's just natural for us to start to begin to invent some ideas or notions about this new learning as we try to make sense of it, right? But that second quote is probably even more important. What we also need to recognize is we sometimes start to respond to this new learning based on these invented and erroneous notions, okay? Now, how many of you were at last year's Boston conference by chance, LSSC 2012? Okay, a few hands. And so you might have remembered there was a talk there by Jeff Patton titled Lean and Kanban Myths and Misconceptions. So here we are in 2013 talking about myth and misconceptions. Again, why are we doing this year after year? Well, Janice, you actually did a great job of kind of introducing why we're doing this year after year. Several of us met at one of the leadership retreats at the end of 2012 in November. This one was in San Diego. I was at the one in Iceland too, the very first one, and the next one's coming up in Meyerhofen as well. But the 20 or so of us that gathered there, there was a group of experienced coaches and trainers and practitioners. And as we developed our just-in-time agenda, we realized, as Janice said, there's still a lot of invented and erroneous notions. I was going to use a different word, but David caught me there. There's still a lot of stuff out there that seems to be invented and erroneous about the Kanban method. And it might be worthwhile to take advantage of that in a track like this, in a conference like this, and help get this out and discuss it. Okay? So we can maybe steer it in a different direction than it's going right now. So one of the key ideas, I guess, that came out of that session for me, and what I'm saying is if you go away with nothing but this, just go away with this at least, I think I've at least done some value here today in the 40 minutes that we have. Don't let myths and misconceptions about the Kanban method limit your unique learning of what it is and how it's applied. So put those other words in there. Don't let invented and erroneous notions about the Kanban method, and not just those that you're going to read from others, but those that you might be inventing yourself, all right? Now, when you came in here, I asked the room monitor to help me pass this out. Hopefully, most of you have these. You don't need it for the session, but it's something you can take away as a reminder of what we talked about today. There's some more in the back. I think I brought plenty. On one side, you're going to see the basic principles of the Kanban method and the core practices, okay? And on the other side, you're going to see a list of myths and misconceptions, about 10 of them, I believe. And some of those represent what we saw, or we talked about, at the leadership retreat, okay? So I'm not going to go through each one of those one by one. And you're probably thinking, great, because I don't want to listen to this for 10 minutes, the whole discussion on these. But what I want to do, actually, is I want to talk about what I think are 3 very broadly and generally discussed myths and misconceptions about the Kanban method that I think form the foundation for a lot of the myths and misconceptions you see on that list, and probably some of the ones you've already heard about or are going to hear about very shortly, okay? So I want to start with this first one that I think is out there broadly and invented and erroneous, if you will, about the Kanban method. And usually when I'm listening to people talk about the Kanban method, I can kind of spot this one because they'll use words like, since we switched to Kanban from XYZ, we don't do this and we don't do that. And the key word I want you to listen when you hear people talk about the Kanban method is when you hear them talk about it in the context of switching, as if they're replacing a workflow process in particular with the Kanban method, and we'll see why that's probably an issue. Okay, so as you see on the sheet, you can see here, I'm not going to go over every one of these, but just point to them. What I want you to recognize is these are the basic principles of the Kanban method. And you'll notice that they're very non-prescriptive, as principles typically are, but even more so, there is nothing there specifically geared towards or limiting itself to software development or IT and IS services, right? And if you look at the practices, same thing. These are a little bit more prescriptive than the principles, as they should be. But relative to other practices, in particular those related to software development and or IT and IS services, you can see these are relatively non-prescriptive. Again, nothing specific to IT. So if you were trying to develop software with just these practices, you might be one of those who are saying things about the Kanban method like, it's insufficient. It's insufficient for developing software. Well, if you're saying that, you might be looking at the Kanban method like this picture here, looking at it through a software development lens. And while you recognize everything in this picture, it still doesn't make sense. You see a young lady sitting at the end of an empty pool with a cascading waterfall or a plastic sheet, as my wife would say. It's all very recognizable, but it just doesn't make sense, okay? So instead, like this quote here, change your perspective. So if you're one of those or listening to somebody talk about it as if it's software development methodology, change your perspective, and as this quote says, you change your experience of life, or at least your experience of life with the Kanban method, okay? So if you do that, tilt your head a little bit, you see a picture, the same picture, but now, even though all those parts are recognizable still, it also makes a little bit more sense. You see a young lady sitting at the edge of a pool filled with water, holding herself in a horizontal position. And so you might even look at it something like a change management tool, not necessarily a software methodology. And it makes much more sense. Okay? So I'll close out this particular one with this picture here. This is obviously a duck, right? So if you're looking at the Kanban method through a software development lens, it's like looking at this picture and calling it a duck. But it doesn't walk or quack or fly like a duck. And so although you may think it's a duck from a shape form, look at it from a different perspective, and I think you'll have a lot better understanding and success with using the Kanban method. Okay? All right. So the second general and broad, invented, and erroneous notion that I see out there about the Kanban method, I usually hear expressed in forms like this. We've tried the Kanban method, or we've seen teams that are using the Kanban method, and from what I can tell from my observation, sometimes it's arm's length observation, it's really just Scrum without time boxes, or without iterations, or without estimation. Has anybody ever heard that? Is anybody telling anyone like that? Okay, good, good. So anyways, what I want to do is, just as before, I have 3 quotes here. I'm going to be quiet for just a few seconds again, let you read these, because I think they set the stage for talking about this particular myth and misconception. Okay. So first I want to give credit for the where these quotes came from. If you went to last year's conference in Boston, and many of you did raise your hands, you might have heard Stephen Spears speak there at one of the keynotes. And all these quotes come from his book, The High Velocity Edge. And I think they're all scattered about in Chapter 1. And I put them up here because I think they really help us talk about this invented and erroneous notion about the Kanban method. And that's really that people are looking, when they see a team using the Kanban method, and they're just looking at an artifact like they don't do time boxed iterations, for example. They're looking at just the use of the tool, but not really digging deeper into the use of the tool. And I think, like Stephen here suggests, it's really the learning and the discovery process in using the tool, too, that makes the Kanban method, I think, more beneficial to you, not just simply what the result was. So got to dig deeper, okay? And so that's what this slide is all about here. When you see or hear somebody talking about the Kanban method as Scrum with just a tweaker here, you know, I'm asking you to ask them, if not for yourself at least, go a little deeper, okay? Go a little deeper and start asking them questions like, well, what was the problem you were trying to solve? What was the problem that TimeBox were creating for you, okay? And what drove you or motivated you to looking at the Kanban method? And when you started to apply the Kanban method, what insights did it provide, and why did it move you or drive you towards eliminating the fixed time box iteration? And if you do that, I think you'll begin to get a better sense of what the Kanban method is really about. It's not just simply that you tweaked something in your process. It's really much more about the learning and discovering process that goes along with it. So, as this slide here reminds us, the Kanban method does not replace your current workflow process, but start thinking in terms of it adds to it. Okay? It's a learning tool and a knowledge creation tool. Okay? And I want to talk about this one just a little bit more because I can relate my own personal experience when I first started using the Kanban method. So I was working with actually several development teams, and we were using XP practices. We were a very disciplined team by then, and we were using a lot of Scrum process practices as well that you're familiar with. One of them here is the time box, okay? And in theory, as I say here, we were trying to have this uniform fixed length interval kind of be the core of our process here. And we were also trying to have all of our activities lined up, you know, either at the beginning or end of this fixed time box interval. You guys are all familiar with that, many of you, right? Okay. Well, in our context, in practice, as you can see from this bottom line, a lot of the times what we ended up with is situations like this, where we just couldn't get the work nicely and partitioned in a good way to fit in that time box interval. And also we had other times when we just came in way under because we were trying to not exceed that interval. And we spent a lot of energy and a lot of time trying to do that. And so we said, how's this working for us? And the answer is it wasn't working very well. So that's when we started looking at something different, a different tool. Okay? We started to look into principles of flow, and in particular the Kanban method, as we realized that had a lot to do with principles of flow. And we discovered that we could replace those fixed uniform time boxes with a small set of ununiformed intervals, if you will, along with some probabilities that would let us know, I'll give you the better picture here, that let us know how many of these small items are we going to see, and how big of an interval are they going to fit in. And then how about these blue items that are just a little bit bigger? And then how about these orange items that are just a little bit bigger? So the key point I'm trying to make here is it wasn't just our current workflow process taking out something. It was our current workflow process tweaked and adding something to it, but adding something to it by using the Kanban method to give us a different perspective, a different insight as a learning tool, knowledge creation tool. And this is the way that same picture looks here in a different form, maybe a little more accessible. Okay, as you can see, these tall columns here show you that we had quite a large number of small items. It wouldn't be a surprise because we were an XP shop, and that's what we were motivated to do even before we heard about the Kanban method and the benefits of using small batches. Okay? And that's basically what this chart is trying to show you. As we applied those principles of flow, we tried to minimize the size of those large batches coming through our workflow. Okay? And here's just another picture of it. Got to go through the animation there. It's those same intervals, if you will, that I showed on this previous bar chart, frequency table, and just now showing you a temporal view of this information as well. So now, not only did we know how many of those small and medium and large things we should see, we got a really good idea of when we would start to see some that were just a little too big, and we could start to learn, well, what happened during that time? And so we really did a lot more than just, quote-unquote, getting rid of estimating. We really learned how to better understand our system. Okay? And so along those lines, too, we also stopped believing that we had to have all our workflow activities end and start on these uniform fixed intervals. All right? Now, we still did acceptance reviews on these fixed uniform intervals because that was really a nice way to put on the calendars, of our external stakeholders. They really liked that idea of meeting every 2 weeks, and we would show them that. But many of the other activities we stopped doing on a 2-week cycle, if you will, or whatever your interval is. And for example, the input queue replenishment activity, which is something similar to the sprint planning, if you will, we started doing that about every 35 days plus or minus 7. Well, where did that come from? That came from measuring and managing these larger work items called epics, and as they went through the workflow, we realized that we would get one done about every 28 to 42 days. So we still did, quote-unquote, sprint planning, we just didn't do it every 2 weeks. Okay? That's the big key, because I hear people saying, we've used the Kanban method, Frank, but our team really liked doing planning, and since we don't do iterations, or since Kanban doesn't have iterations, we don't do planning. And I said, no. You still do planning, you just don't do 2-week fixed time box iterations. Okay? So they're using the word iteration and time box synonymously, which brings me to this slide. I get so agitated when I hear somebody say, we don't iterate anymore in the Kanban method. And there's the word iteration and there's the word iterate. And I want to make it clear, we continued in our development to do an iterative style of development. Our stories still had very much went through the workflow and still very much had feedback coming from the reviews. That feedback went in. Sometimes the story didn't get completed. The story would just hold up there and get a little adjusted. Other times that feedback came in and a new story came through. The point is, just because you get rid of the quote-unquote fixed time box iteration, it doesn't mean you stop iterating. So that's one of those myths and misconceptions, I think, that are out there about the Kanban method. I'm going to finish up on this one here with this quote. And this is just a recent discussion, doing some work and happened to be talking to Paul about this particular invented and erroneous notion about the Kanban method. And as he went through our discussion, you could kind of see a little light turn on in his head. And he said, I'm getting it now, I'm getting it. We're getting rid of this artificial construct, if you will, and we're replacing it with a lot more learning about our system. And I think that summarizes it right there. Okay? Okay. This is the third broad and general erroneous notion, invented erroneous notion that I think I hear most often. And when I do listen to people talk about the Kanban method and I hear these kinds of terms, you'll hear it in the form of, we've looked at the Kanban method or we've seen others using the Kanban method and we've come to this conclusion that it's best for command and control. Or it's best for complicated or simple problems, not for complex problems like developing new features or new products. Or it's best for operations and bug fixes and maintenance, and it's not really good for, again, developing new features or new products. Okay? Anybody heard that? Wow. I thought that'd be more common. Well, good. Maybe this one is not as common as I thought. It was in San Diego. So once again, here's a couple of quotes that I think set the stage for discussing this particular invented and erroneous notion. So I'll be quiet and get another sip of water and let you read these and we'll go forward. Okay. So how many of you have heard the first one? All models are wrong, some are useful. Okay, now how can something be wrong and useful? We'll take a look at a good example of that here in just a second, okay? I think when you first see that, it's like, wow, that's kind of weird, but it's true. I think it's true. But you can also get in trouble if you believe what you're using is always true. And then the last one, I think, is actually more relevant, and you're going to see that. And that's, as we learn about something new, it's natural for us as we begin to try to make sense of it, to pick out the parts that we like, pick out the parts that support maybe what we're looking for and the way we want to think, ignore all the rest, and more importantly, we make allies of those people who share the same decisions that we just made, and we make enemies of all the rest who think differently, when in fact we probably should be talking more to the people who think differently, and instead we make enemies of the rest. Do we see some of that? Some of it, yeah. Okay. So here's an example of why, if some people are going to be using models to help them make sense of the Kanban method, they really should understand, first of all, the problem with using a model, or at least what you should consider when using a model, okay? How many have been to London? Okay, good. So a lot of you know the tube, right? And this map, not this particular version of the map, but a map of the tube has been around for a long time. As you can see, I think they're celebrating 150 years. I didn't look back and see what form the tube existed in 150 years ago, but it's been around a long time. And the point I'm making is this map wouldn't be around a long time unless it was useful. But it's also wrong. It's wrong in the sense that the tube doesn't exist like this underground in London, okay? But it's obviously created this way because it's more useful to look at it this way, all right? So let's walk through an example of how something can be wrong and yet useful, and the problem you get into if you don't remember you're using a model. Okay, so this story comes out of the book Obliquity. Anybody read the book Obliquity? Okay, and the author, I think it's John Kay, if not mistaken, and I'm not sure if this is his personal story, but he relates this story in the book. And he's talking about how he's going to meet friends at a party in London, and he's coming from another city in England via the trains, and so he's going to be getting off at the train station in Paddington, which is right up here, and then he's going to get on the tube and make his way using this model to this party that he's going to. So he gets off Paddington and he takes the tube to Notting Hill Gate. He makes a switch at Notting Hill Gate and goes to Lancaster Gate. And then he gets off the tube and he makes his 1 block or 1.5 block walk to the party at Hyde Park. Okay? And when he gets there, the first thing he does is he apologizes to his host because he's late. And he just didn't realize that it was going to take him that long on the tube to get from Paddington to his destination. Well, his host and his friends at the party kind of laugh and chuckle at him like, why did you take the tube? Okay, and he says, well, later on he finds out what he actually did using another model is he actually took the tube again from Paddington to Notting Hill Gate, which is quite a distance, as you can see. And then he switched onto the red train, and he basically doubles back for almost, all intents and purposes, back to Lancaster Gate. And then he walks to his destination. Okay? And now he finds out why they're laughing at him. They're laughing at him because he could have just walked to his destination. And so again, this illustrates the problem with using a model and not understanding the assumptions that were made in using the model, as well as the assumptions you're making in using the model. So now, how does that apply? I think when people make statements about the Kanban method, like we saw earlier, they're using several models here. Okay? They're using, for example, the Schneider model for the top, and they're saying things like, I see command and control. But I think the reason why they're doing that is they're ignoring some parts about the Schneider model that are important. okay? Or they're ignoring some of their own assumptions, and they're making friends with the parts that are what they want to hear and making enemies of the parts that they don't want to hear. And the same thing with this second one is probably one that people are using, the Kanban model, if you're familiar with that. Okay? And they're coming to these conclusions that Kanban is only good for complicated and ordered problems as opposed to complex problems. Okay? And then the last one, I think they're probably using the model, the old model, of pool systems or Kanban systems being used in manufacturing systems, and thinking that that's pretty much like DevOps. There's no iterative planning in a bug. What happens is an event and you service it. And I think that's what they're doing is they're seeing Kanban, but they're only seeing parts of it because they're using this model and only looking at the parts they like and ignoring the rest. Okay? So how do you handle that? How do you take care of somebody's erroneous use of a model? Well, you give them another model, right? And so this is a model on how to use assumptions, in particular on maybe other models. And so I would advocate that you look carefully at the assumptions of any model you're using to help you make sense of the Kanban method and list those out using this model here, especially identify the ones that you think are most important in your context to maybe take a closer look. And also your own assumptions as well. And look at those ones that you think are the key ones to validate and the ones that are probably most uncertain. Don't waste your time on all the rest, but at least do a couple of them before you go off and start telling people this is the Kanban method based on this model. Look at your assumptions and look at the model's assumptions before you do that. And then test them and validate them, okay? Yours and the models. So I want to talk about the Schneider model just a bit because I think that's the one. How many people are familiar with the Schneider model? Okay, just a few. I'll talk about it just really quick. It's a quad model, just like the one you saw. In the upper right hand is command and control, competency, and the lower left, or excuse me, the upper left is collaboration and cultivation. I always forget cultivation, but that's in the lower left. And the theory behind this model is you can divide that along the right. And most of these are, the command and control and competency would fit better in certain cultures of certain organizations. And so the premise of using this model is you really need to know the culture in your organization and then align whatever tactics you're using with the culture in your organization. So they look at the Kanban method, and what words do they see? Visualize your process. So what word do they pick up? Process. Measure and manage flow. So which words do they pick up? Measure and manage. And so immediately they map you into the command and control quadrant, and now they tell you that Kanban method is only good, or best aligned for command and control, but many people read that as in only good for command and control. And if you look at the Schneider model a little bit more closely, you'll realize that that model suggests they're not advocating that any one of those cultures is better than the other. So if you're using a model that's not advocating you should use one culture or the other, but just align with that culture, and you yourself are bringing an assumption that this side is not as good as this side, there's a misalignment there. So at least acknowledge that and talk about that as you're making sense of the Kanban method using that particular model. So that's just one example here. So I think I got my 10-minute mark, so I'm going to wrap things up here. Coming back full circle, as I said, once again, remind you, please, if you remember anything about the presentation, this is the key one, I think, here. Don't let those myths and misconceptions, those invented and erroneous notions about the Kanban method limit your unique learning of what it is or how it's applied. And that includes your own. Check yourself every once in a while, too. Am I just assuming here? And what's that leading me? How is that limiting me, I should say, with the Kanban method and my use of it? And then, take advantage and go out and talk to some of the people in this room, some of the people you're going to meet out there, get on the Kanban Dev, find a Limited Whip Society, and find somebody who disagrees with you and is willing to have a constructive conversation. And I think that's where you'll learn more rather than just accepting blindly somebody else's assumptions or not testing your own. Okay? Because if you don't do that, you're going to fall into this. Myths and misconceptions will limit your learning and benefit of the Kanban method. All right, so that's my talk, Kanban Myths and Misconceptions. I think I probably have at least a little bit more than 5 minutes. That's my contact information, in particular email and the website if you want to get a hold of me later. But I'll be around for the next 3 days and also doing a tutorial here on Thursday. But let me go ahead and turn it over to some questions now.